talk, and it is named for the title of the book, Palestine, The Legitimacy of Hope. And of course, we have copies available here for you to check out by Richard Falk, who's Professor Emeritus of International Law and Practice at Princeton. He's a distinguished legal scholar, and he recently completed his term as UN Special Rapporteur on occupied Palestine. And with Palestine, The Legitimacy of Hope, he has powerfully illuminated the transformation of the Palestinian struggle over recent years into a struggle for legitimacy similar to that pursued by all the anti-colonial movements of the 20th century. He also was a Edward Said Memorial Lecturer here at the Palestine Center in 2009. So we're very happy to have Professor Falk here with us today to speak about Palestine, the Legitimacy of Hope.
Thank you all for coming, and I thank the Palestine Center for inviting me to talk a bit about the thinking that underlies the book, which derived from my blog, really, and was made into a coherent volume by a very dedicated and talented editorial effort by the publisher, an effort that I probably wouldn't have undertaken on my own had I realized how big it was, but having done it, I'm glad it's been done. Let me say a few things as a matter of background about my own understanding of Palestinian national struggle. In my view, it's gone through four rather overlapping phases that are important to understand because I think it underscores the way in which the struggle now is unfolding, and it in a way, these remarks of mine are trying to justify the title, The Legitimacy of Hope, because if you adopt the kind of realist perspective that's so prevalent among political leaders, one would have to say the legitimacy of despair, because if you consider the continuous encroachment on Palestinian rights by way of the settlement expansion, the ethnic cleansing of Jerusalem, the general drift of Israeli internal opinion, I think symbolized by the election of the most recent president, Reuven Rivlin, who's a lifelong exponent of a one-state Israeli solution, and the fact that he was selected by the Knesset despite the opposition of Netanyahu, who in that context seemed like it's hard to say even, but seemed relatively more moderate in at least openly or blatantly endorsing what I would call the maximalist Zionist vision. This is the culmination of the Zionist project, is the claim to establish a Jewish state that encompasses the entirety of historic Palestine. And this new president has, throughout his career as a political figure, has openly endorsed that solution. Interestingly, he combines that with a view that is very critical of Israel's oppression of the Palestinians. He's way to the left of Netanyahu in terms of internal policy. He favors dismantling the separation wall, getting rid of the checkpoints, making life on a day-to-day basis much more reasonable for the Palestinians. So all they're expected to do is give up their political aspirations, and in exchange they would have a quote-unquote normal and economically decent life within the territorial scope of a Jewish state. And it's a very increasingly accepted as an outcome of the conflict by Israelis internally, either through this kind of explicit sort of claim or implicitly as a de facto reality that arises through the continuous annexation of land in the West Bank, which, as you know, even at the 67 borders only represents 22% of historic Palestine and has been abridged continuously ever since 1967, not only by the settlements but by the network of roads associated with the settlements and land that's set aside for so-called nature preserves and military security purposes, plus the wall and the territory surrounding the wall. So this is a major development, in my view, of a negative character. And as I say, if I was a strict realist, the title of my book would be The Legitimacy of Despair, from the perspective of the Palestinian struggle. But I'm not a realist, and so I chose a title that is in keeping with my understanding of reality. Even though I'm not a realist, I do try to understand what is real. And in that setting, I think it is important to understand these four phases of the Palestinian national struggle. And the first phase was the effort of the Arab neighbors to reject by force the imposition of any kind of Zionist political reality or political entity upon Palestine, and specifically to prevent the establishment of a state of Israel, and once the state was established, to attempt to eliminate it by force of arms. And so the initial wars were wars carried on not by the Palestinians, but by the Arab countries, neighboring countries, that took upon themselves this idea of regional solidarity in reaction to what was perceived as a European colonial solution to the so-called Jewish problem. And that led to the wars, 1948, 1956, 1967, and 1973. And intermingled with this effort to prevent the permanent presence of the Israeli state was the anti-colonial, wider anti-colonial drive that was perhaps best embodied in Nasser's Egypt and its effort to nationalize the Suez Canal and to eliminate the vestiges of European colonialism in the region. And as we all know, this first effort at resolving the Palestinian ordeal was unsuccessful, was a failure. The Arab military capabilities proved no match for the Israeli military capabilities. And the 1967 outcome in particular had a very strong effect here in the U.S., both in the Jewish community and, I believe, in the government, particularly the Pentagon intelligence services. Because prior to 67, there was a sense that Israel was a strategic liability because of the importance of oil and friendly relations with the oil-producing countries, particularly in the Gulf, and their hostility to the whole idea of establishing a Jewish state in the midst of the Arab world. But what the 1967 war conveyed was the strategic capabilities of Israel as a partner in the region, and especially with the demonstration that despite all the weaponry that Saudi Arabia and others had, they were not really a very significant military player in the region. This view of Israel's strategic importance was reinforced by the Iranian Revolution in 78, 79, which meant that Israel and to some degree Turkey were the only strategic allies that had any military capabilities in the region that could uphold not only Israeli security but the security of the Gulf and the oil reserves. So this period of that started really in 1948 with the repudiation of the UN partition plan and continued in one form or another till the 1973 so-called Yom Kippur War represented the first phase, and it was succeeded by a second phase that really involved the embrace, the focused embrace by the Palestinian leadership of a national liberation struggle based on armed resistance, armed liberation, imitating in its explicit models were the role of Vietnam in opposing the United States. It's interesting in the career of Edward Said that he was awakened to the Palestinian struggle by the defeat in 1967 and had that sense that he could no longer turn away in devoting himself to a professional career, but that it was incumbent upon him to participate as a Palestinian in the struggle for Palestinian national liberation. And it was a period of, I think, a hopefulness on the part of the Palestinian people, partly because they were taking ownership of their own struggle. See, if what is at stake in the end is self-determination, it's very important that the self be actively engaged and not be sort of a passive beneficiary of what the Arab countries in the region might do. And it was in this period also that the PLO and the Palestinian National Council adopted in 1988 what should have been a breakthrough to achieve a sustainable peace for both sides. They accepted the legitimacy of Israel as a state in the region, and they accepted the 1967 borders as the basis for a Palestinian state. This is an extraordinary gesture toward peace by the Palestinian movement that's never been appreciated, much less reciprocated, because what it did really was to say the Palestinian movement will live with 22% rather than the 45% that the partition arrangement that the UN had endorsed and had been found unfair and unsatisfactory in 1948. In other words, it was relinquishing even that kind of more equal partition in favor of accepting the realities that resulted from the Israeli success in their so-called War of Independence. And this national movement of liberation relied on armed resistance. It was a effort to use what violent capabilities were at the disposal of the Palestinians, and it's in that context that, of course, they were characterized as a terrorist organization and a terrorist movement, which I think never represented the reality of their resistance, although some of the tactics certainly were associated with any plausible definition of terrorism. But at every stage, in my view, Israeli state terrorism far exceeded Palestinian terrorism from below, if one wants to distinguish terrorism from below and terrorism from above, which is, I think, an important distinction. Of course, states, including the U.S., try to reserve the terminology of terrorism for those that act against the established order and not use it as it should be used to focus on violence against civilian innocence. Whoever uses violence against civilian innocence is engaged in what I think should be characterized as a form of terrorism, certainly as a war crime. This effort at national liberation was also successfully thwarted by the Israeli security capabilities, and by casting the PLO as a terrorist organization, it was able to command for itself the high moral ground in the struggle and portray itself as the victim rather than the victimizer. This this led to two parallel developments. As I say, they're not strictly in a temporal sequence. The first was the Intifada of 1987, which was the beginning of the shift in the Palestinian struggle from a governmentally organized movement to a civil society generated resistance and liberation undertaking. And this was paralleled by the move toward a diplomatic approach to resolving the conflict, the so-called Oslo approach in 1993, which, again, referring to the interesting trajectory of Edward Said's perception of the issue, had the exact opposite effect of 1967. He prophetically understood the 1993 Declaration of Principles and the famous handshake on the White House lawn as a tantamount to a Palestinian surrender. And he took this view on the basis of the failure of the Palestinian leadership to even assert their rights of national self-determination, their willingness to accept a diplomatic framework in which the United States would be the intermediary despite its undisguised partisanship. It's a very flawed framework where the ally of the stronger side also is has the mediating role. It's a guarantee that the weaker side will be blamed for any failures to achieve the desired outcomes. But what was most flawed in the Oslo approach was the exclusion of international law from the diplomatic process. Because the one area where the Palestinians hold a clear systemic advantage is in relation to the international law interpretation of the main issues in conflict, whether it's the status of refugees or Jerusalem or water or borders, all of the settlements, of course, all of the issues, the wall and the day-to-day practices, all of these issues objectively perceived from an international law point of view are extremely favorable to the Palestinians. And for them to accept a diplomacy that excludes these issues can only be understood either by their naivete or by their weakness, or some mixture of the two things. And it was in this context where Said and others were very critical of Arafat's sense that the only path to peace was through the American White House. And his deference to Washington was accounted or was partially accounted for the fact that he was willing to accept this very one-sided form of diplomacy, which interestingly American liberals overwhelmingly greeted as a great breakthrough, because it brought the PLO in from the terrorist cold, and it seemed to create a path that would lead to a solution of the conflict. So you ironically have Said turning toward the Palestinian struggle in '67 when it was apparently suffered a terrible defeat, and turning away from it in 1993 when it seemed to be having a political victory. And in both cases, I think he chose the right path in doing this. But what has happened with this intergovernmental diplomacy has not been a neutral failure, because what it's allowed Israel to do is to consolidate its control over Jerusalem and extend the settlement phenomenon. And the Palestinian situation on the ground is ever worse, and it's been, the unlawfulness has not only been overlooked, but the American political leaders have said that this is creates a new foundation for what the Palestinians can reasonably expect. You may remember George W. Bush's famous exchange of letters with Sharon in 2004, in which he, in effect, said the settlement blocks would, of course, be part of any kind of resolution of the conflict, and that Palestine would have to somehow get some land in the desert to overcome the land that was given up which is the best land on the West Bank, actually, for the settlements. And Hillary Clinton referred to this kind of unlawful accretion of Israeli claims as subsequent developments that must be incorporated in the diplomatic process. So not only was international law, whenever the Palestinians became brave enough to raise it in the negotiating process, they were told, this obstructs the peace process. Wait till the final status negotiations are completed, and then those questions will be appropriate. But in the meantime, don't create waves by raising these issues. When you do that, in effect, you're saying that diplomacy is a bargaining process, and that makes the disparities in power the decisive element in achieving some kind of agreement. And so, and that, of course, is what Israel and the U.S. Sought to achieve, was not a sustainable and just peace, but a peace that could be, that the Palestinians would be forced to swallow, that was unjust and unsustainable, probably. And the Second Intifada, for instance, was as much a message to the PLO leadership not to swallow some kind of inadequate understanding of Palestinian self-determination, and as it was a reaction to Israel's oppressive occupation. The fourth and, to me, decisive phase of this long conflict is the civil society momentum that started with the two intifadas and has grown, especially in its extension to a global solidarity movement that centers on the BDS campaign, which, it's important to note, was initiated by a call from 170 Palestinian civil society organizations back in 2005. And it, in my view, expresses the political aspirations and will of the Palestinian people better than the formal leadership in Ramallah or any kind of governmental entity. Neither Hamas nor the Palestinian Authority can speak with authenticity on behalf of the Palestinian people, but increasingly I think it's recognized that these civil society orientations do provide a clear understanding of what could, in the end, provide realization of Palestinian rights under international law and under international morality. And the other thing that I want to say about the argument of the book is that if you look at the way in which political conflicts have been resolved since World War II in the global South or in the Middle East, Asia, and Africa, the side that wins is not the side that controls the battlefield. The side that wins commands the heights of morality and law. Now and why do they? It's a mysterious assertion, and it contradicts what was true before 1945, where military power was the primary agency of history. But since 1945, the primary agency of history has been people, not military weaponry. And that's an anti-realist lesson that neither Israel nor the United States have learned. It was the lesson that the U.S. should have learned after the Vietnam War, where it controlled every dimension of the military conflict and had total domination of the battlefield, and yet lost the war. So how did that happen? How it happens is that the advantage of an indigenous population is its patience, its national resolve, its resilience in the face of being able to absorb enormous losses that the intervening or dominating side usually can't handle. The Afghans have a proverb, "You have the watches, we have the time." See, it's a very instructive proverb. And there was a conversation between an American counterinsurgency colonel and his Vietnamese counterpart shortly after the Vietnam War, and the American said to the Vietnamese, "You know, you never beat us on the battlefield." And the Vietnamese response was, "You're correct, but it's irrelevant." See, and why is it that it's irrelevant? Because of this quality of indigenous nationalism being able to absorb pain in ways that foreign interveners are not, and not to lose its political will to persist in its pursuit of its aspirations. And I think that this is where the Palestinian consciousness has been moving toward, and it's what enabled the South African anti-apartheid movement to succeed against the odds also. And it recalls a little bit the often quoted Gandhi statement, first they ignore you, then they laugh at you, then they fight you, then you win. And it is the path of these struggles in the last 75 years, where the aspirations converged with the sense of legitimacy of what was being demanded. See, and that sense of legitimacy didn't exist previously, nor did the sense of entitlement exist previously. Really, the non-Western peoples learned from the West the legitimacy of national liberation. And the idea, and this template that I think is a source of hope for the Palestinian struggle and people, applies only in situations of foreign domination or foreign intervention. It doesn't apply to national movements of oppression that are autocratic in their character. For instance, Tibet doesn't win, or Chechnya doesn't win. The Egyptian people don't win because they're essentially being suppressed by their own leadership, by elements of their own society. But to the extent that the Zionist project is seen as a foreign imposition, and of course everything about it legitimated in events that were either colonialist or European in their character, makes it one of probably the primary instance of an unresolved colonial struggle. It's not a pure colonial struggle, but none of them were altogether pure, particularly the struggles against settler colonialism of the sort that existed in South Africa, where there was no home country to retreat to. Whether this, how this development plays out, under what conditions will Israel recalculate its interests in such a way as to be ready to make a sustainable and just peace, is of course something one can't foretell. In my view, two essential moves Israel would have to make. One is releasing Mustafa, I always get these Barghoutis, Marwan Barghouti from prison. He's not Nelson Mandela, but he would have the capacity to unify Palestinian people and would be a symbol of that shift in determination on Israel's part. And the other part would be to accept the original conception of the Zionist project, which was to establish a Jewish homeland, not a Jewish state. And the move from homeland to state is a crucial move that has made the attainment of any kind of sustainable agreement extremely difficult. I'm told that my time is up, and I must be obedient to our hosts, and thank you for your patience, and I welcome your questions. Thank you.
I just have a problem with the word, with the term legitimacy compared to legality. Here, you said that. I mean, do the Palestinians? Is there any question about the legitimacy of the Palestinians struggling? They don't have to struggle. It's already there are so many legitimate factors in their demand. There are so many legal. Also, you said it already that international law is in favor of the Palestinians. So how do you differentiate and use the word legitimacy and legality in this sense?
It's a very good question, important question. My reason for using legitimacy rather than legality as the central concept is because legitimacy incorporates both law and morality. And it also is a way of invoking a certain kind of sense of human dignity that is not reducible altogether to law. And I think it's important. The part of what is involved with legitimacy is the generation of moral outrage, which is what has, I think, changed this climate internationally. Not so much the fact that Israel violates the rights of Palestinians, but it also does so in a manner that evokes this sense of moral outrage on the part of more and more people around the world. The events in Gaza of this past summer, I think, are part of that dynamic.
We'll go right here, and then we'll come across.
Thank you, Professor Falk. My question pertains to the ICC. I attended a panel on Monday at George Mason University where legal scholars participated, and they all basically said that it's not really that easy to go for the Palestinians to go to the ICC, and in fact, more than likely it would be the Palestinians that would be liable if they go. So, what is the alternative? What can the Palestinians do to not only to highlight Israeli transgressions and aggression, in fact, and the killing of Palestinians, but also to have some sort of legal recourse, some sort of punishment, if you will. Thank you.
Well, of course, as I say, the Palestinian Authority is under great pressure from Washington and Israel not to use law as a means of advancing their political struggle. And they've been discouraged every time they've tried, and when they've tried, as they did in relation to the separation wall in 2005, and achieved a very impressive 14-to-1 judgment. It's unusual for any question before that court to get that degree of unanimity. And the one judge, surprisingly, well, you'll all be surprised, was the American judge, which meant all the Western European judges supported the sort of common sense notion that an occupying power is violating international humanitarian law if it constructs this kind of barrier on occupied territory. You just have to think back to the Cold War. If the Soviets had extended the Berlin Wall 1 foot into Western Berlin, there would have been World War III. So it's a notion that that there is a kind of set of clear guidelines embedded in international law. But Israel completely defied that decision, as it defied the Goldstone report and will defy, I'm sure, the Shabbos report that will come from the investigation of the Protective Edge military operation of this summer. But it's important to realize that these initiatives, even though they're rejected officially, contribute to the progress in the legitimacy wars. So they have a symbolic value, even if they can't modify the behavior on the ground. And that's important. As far as the ICC is concerned, I think the issue is not as clear as your panel made it out to be, that there is a good argument for using Palestinian statehood to test the objectivity of the court. It is possible that and quite likely that Hamas's use of rockets would also be treated as a war crime. But any kind of fair-minded assessment that looked at the casualties, that looked at the settlements, that looked at all these dimensions of the situation would still have to conclude, as the Goldstone report concluded, that the preponderance of responsibility is on the Israeli side, and that crimes against humanity and war crimes have been committed on a systematic and large-scale basis. And one of those crimes is the imposition of collective punishment on the 1.7 or 8 million people living in Gaza, and collective punishment is prohibited by Article 33 of the Fourth Geneva Convention. And it takes a particularly grotesque form in these periodic recourses to large-scale violence by Israel, of locking a civilian population into a combat zone. Even in Syria and Iraq, that never happens. The people at least have a default option of becoming refugees or seeking some safety by going to becoming internally displaced persons. In Gaza, they're literally locked in to the combat zone unless they have a foreign passport, which 800 people had, and those people were able to leave. But if you envision the situation of an entire population being entrapped in a combat zone, it's not surprising that mental health specialists increasingly talk about the collective traumatization of the Gazan population, particularly children.
Go over here, and then we'll come to this side of the room as well.
What did I do? Oh, yes, tightly.
Hold it very tightly. Thank you, Richard. This was extraordinary. My question, and I ask this in the context of what you described as the globalization of the Palestinian liberation movement, and I think one of the aspects of that is that here in the U.S., the broad movement has come to understand that it will not be the call of people here to say 1 state, 2 states, 5 states, 10 states, but rather having a rights-based approach will be the push forward. In that context, I'm wondering why you saw it as particularly negative to see the position of the new Israeli president who is pushing for this sort of one-state arrangement where it's not about whether we like it or don't like it, but do you think this gives Palestinians in the region the opportunity to move forward on this transformation of the struggle for rights, for civil rights and for equality in that currently apartheid-style state?
Well, that's an interesting question, Phyllis, and I've taken, because he's the right, I've sort of assumed, and maybe inappropriately, that because he's always been on the right wing of the Likud party, that he's not the path to peace. This idea of striking a Faustian bargain with the Palestinian people, that they will supposedly have a moderate life, and he doesn't have much leverage in that part of his position anyway. But even if that were to be implemented, you're expecting the Palestinian movement to swallow the idea of an Israeli state, because that's the essence of his proposal. His proposal is not to grant rights as a matter of rights. It's a matter of establishing an Israeli state that encompasses the entire historic Palestine, and then creating economic peace and normalizing the life of the Palestinian people.
Sorry, maybe I wasn't clear enough. I was saying, does that give the opportunity for Palestinians to then launch in a new way the struggle for equality and de-Zionization, de-Judaization, etc.?
Yes, and I think if in that sense, that because he's in effect acknowledging, and he does acknowledge that and that's why Netanyahu opposed him, I think. He acknowledges the unjustness of the way in which the occupation has been implemented, claims it's not necessary for security, and is a cruel and unacceptable way of administering the occupied territories, and he'd like to eliminate the occupation and replace it with this fulfillment of the Zionist project.
I'm going to go over here.
Hello.
Hi.
I want to very much, first of all, thank you for your service over the last several years as Special Rapporteur at the UN for Palestinian rights. I think you've done an excellent job in a very difficult situation, as we know. Really appreciate it, first of all. And then secondly, I'd like to get into a little bit more about the geopolitical situation in the region, and also possibly globally with the BRICS and others, and the shifts in power that are occurring, both regionally and then internationally. I think many of us that have been involved for a long time had hoped that might open kind of a vacuum in space, and yet it's a bit frightening, both within the region, the way things are going, but also internationally, where Israel is making arms deals, let's say with India, and relationships with China and others, as usual, kind of out front because they have the power, and they're the biggest power between the two. So do you see anything positive coming out of those things, and how do you think it might impact Palestinian rights? And
No, that's a very good and important, though difficult, question. I think after the Arab Spring in 2011, there was reason to be hopeful about the regional developments, and the posture of Turkey, especially after the Mavi Marmara incident in 2010, did represent a real shift in the regional outlook. But what has happened in these last 3 years is basically a regression that makes the situation in several ways worse than it was in 2011. For instance, Sisi is a more bloody, autocratic leader than was Mubarak, and his form of bloodiness is directed against the Muslim Brotherhood and, by extension, Hamas. So that's a very adverse development. If you look at what Saudi Arabia has done in the recent phases of the conflict, is to virtually openly side with Israel, because Israel is the enemy of its primary enemy, and its primary enemy is now not Shiism, which is the sort of sectarian dimension and accounts for the tension with Iran, but rather it's Islamism from below. It's the Brotherhood, which is a grassroots type form of political Islam, and they would rather have their Muslim brothers slaughtered than see that kind of political Islam succeed, because it's perceived to be a threat to their own stability, to their own dynastic stability. I would just add, there's a lot more that could be said. there's a helpful analogy, I think, to the 1848 revolutions in Europe, which gave rise also to counter-revolutions, but they also gave rise to counter-revolutions. And one way of thinking about the Middle East at this stage is to say we're waiting for the counter-revolution. It's not over.